The island rises gradually from the Pacific, its slopes covered in uneven green, broken by rock and narrow ridgelines. It sits far from major shipping routes, positioned in the open ocean off the western coast of South America. The nearest mainland lies more than 600 kilometers away. The surrounding waters are deep and cold, shaped by steady currents and seasonal winds that rarely pause. This is part of the Juan Fernandez Archipelago, a small and isolated group of islands known more for their distance than for their presence. Fog moves across the hills in the early hours, then clears to reveal steep cliffs and scattered vegetation. Fresh water runs in small streams, though not always reliably. The coastline offers limited access, rocky edges, shifting surf, and few places suitable for landing. There are no permanent human settlements here during the early 18th century, no structures, no marked paths. Only traces of passing ships, occasional fires left behind by sailors, and the presence of animals introduced by earlier expeditions. At first, the island appears stable. It offers water, vegetation, and some shelter from the wind. But its isolation defines it more than its resources. Once a person is left here, departure depends entirely on chance. In 1704, one man would arrive on this island and remain here, completely alone, for years. Not by accident alone, but by a decision that could not be reversed. Alexander Selkirk was born in 1,676 inches, Lower Largo, a small coastal village in Fife, Scotland. The village faced the North Sea, and like many communities along that coast, its economy and daily life were closely tied to maritime work. Fishing, trade, and seafaring were common occupations. Selkirk grew up in this environment where knowledge of the sea was practical rather than formal. Details of his early life are limited. Records suggest he had a difficult temperament. There are accounts of disputes with family members and local authorities, including an incident that may have involved church discipline. Such conflicts were not unusual for young men in port towns, where long absences at sea and uncertain livelihoods shaped behavior. By his late 20s, Selkirk had turned fully to life at sea. He joined privateering expeditions, which were state-sanctioned operations allowing privately owned ships to attack and capture enemy vessels during wartime. At the time, Britain was engaged in the War of the Spanish Succession, and privateering offered both income and risk. Crews operated under legal authority, but often faced conditions similar to piracy, long voyages, limited supplies, and constant exposure to danger. Selkirk served as a sailing master, a role that required navigation skills and responsibility for the ship's sailing operations. He was known to be competent and experienced, familiar with reading weather patterns and managing long-distance voyages. In 1703, he joined an expedition led by William Dampier, an English navigator and privateer with extensive experience in the Pacific. Selkirk was assigned to the ship Cinque Ports, one of two vessels in the expedition. The mission involved sailing around South America into the Pacific to raid Spanish shipping and settlements. The voyage was difficult from the beginning. Ships of this type were often poorly maintained, and conditions at sea could quickly expose structural weaknesses. The Cinque Ports in particular began to show signs of deterioration as it moved along the South American coast. Worm damage to the hull, leaks, and general wear created increasing concern among the crew. Selkirk's position required him to assess these risks closely. Over time, he became convinced that the ship was no longer seaworthy. His concerns were not shared by everyone on board. Disagreements between officers were common in such expeditions, especially when financial pressure and the promise of captured goods influenced decision-making. By September 1704, the expedition reached the Juan Fernandez Islands. The ships anchored to rest, repair, and resupply. It was here, on one of these remote islands, that Selkirk made a judgment that would separate him from the crew and place him into complete isolation. The decision did not come from sudden panic. It followed weeks of observation, calculation, and growing disagreement about the condition of the vessel he was expected to trust with his life. In September 1704, the Cinque Ports anchored off one of the Juan Fernandez Islands to take on fresh water and allow time for basic repairs. The stop was routine. Ships traveling long distances depended on such islands to restore limited supplies and make temporary adjustments to damaged structures. By this point in the voyage, the condition of the ship had become a central concern for Alexander Selkirk. The hull showed clear signs of deterioration. Worms, common to warm waters, had weakened the wood, creating small openings that allowed water to seep through. The crew had already spent time attempting repairs, but the materials and tools available were limited. What could be fixed on open water was often only temporary. Selkirk assessed the situation based on his experience. As sailing master, he understood the risks of continuing with a compromised vessel, especially across long stretches of open ocean. In his judgment, the ship was unlikely to survive the remainder of the journey. He believed that staying on the island offered a higher chance of survival than remaining on board. The ship's captain, Thomas Stradling, did not agree. Disputes between the two had developed over time, and this disagreement brought them to a final point. The crew prepared to leave the island after resupplying, intending to continue their mission despite the damage. Selkirk made a decision that was both deliberate and irreversible. He asked to be put ashore. At the time, this was not entirely uncommon. Sailors occasionally chose to leave ships under extreme disagreement, though such decisions carried significant risk. Once left behind, return depended entirely on another ship arriving, which could take months, years, or never happen at all. Selkirk was given a small number of supplies. Historical records indicate he had clothing, bedding, a musket, gunpowder, tools, and a Bible. These items reflected what could be spared rather than what would guarantee survival. As the Cinque Ports prepared to depart, Selkirk remained on the shore. Accounts suggest that he may have reconsidered as the ship began to move away, but by then the decision had been accepted by the captain. The distance between ship and land increased steadily. Within hours, the vessel disappeared beyond the horizon. Selkirk was left alone on the island, with no immediate way to leave, and no certainty that anyone would return. After the departure of the Cinque Ports, the island remained unchanged in appearance. The same hills, streams, and coastal edges continued as before. What changed was Selkirk's position within it. There was no longer a structure of command, no shared labor, and no immediate direction. The first stage of his isolation was defined by adjustment. His initial supplies were limited. The musket and gunpowder provided a means of hunting, but only for as long as the ammunition lasted. The tools allowed for basic construction and repair. The clothing and bedding were suitable for short-term use, but not designed for extended exposure to the environment. There was no system in place. Each need had to be addressed directly. Fresh water was available from small streams that ran through parts of the island. These sources were not evenly distributed, so Selkirk needed to identify reliable locations and remain within range of them. Establishing access to water became the first stable element in his routine. Food required more effort. The island supported populations of wild goats, originally introduced by earlier sailors. These animals moved across the hills and could be hunted, though not easily. At first, Selkirk relied on his firearm. This method was effective but finite. Powder and shot could not be replaced. Over time, he began to pursue goats on foot, learning their movement patterns and the terrain they favored. Other food sources supplemented this effort. Fish could be caught along the shoreline, depending on weather and access points. There were also edible plants, including wild cabbage and other vegetation known to grow on the island. These provided some variation, though they required identification and consistent gathering. Shelter was necessary, but not immediately complex. At first, Selkirk used natural features, trees, rock formations, and existing clearings to reduce exposure to wind and weather. Later, he constructed more stable structures. Historical accounts suggest he built at least 2 huts using wood and vegetation. These provided basic protection and allowed him to organize his limited possessions. Fire became an essential tool. It allowed for cooking, warmth, and a degree of control over the environment. Maintaining fire required constant attention, especially in conditions where wind or rain could extinguish it. Without a reliable method to create fire easily, preservation of an existing flame became critical. As his initial supplies diminished, Selkirk adapted his methods. When ammunition was no longer available, he relied entirely on physical pursuit to capture goats. This required endurance and familiarity with the terrain. Over time, his physical condition adjusted to meet these demands. He moved more efficiently across uneven ground and developed techniques suited to the island rather than to the ship. Clothing also required adaptation. The garments he had brought began to wear down under constant use. To replace them, he used goat skins, shaping them into coverings that could withstand the environment more effectively. This process depended on the tools he had retained and his ability to work materials without assistance. Each of these actions formed part of a developing system. There was no single solution to survival. Instead, Selkirk created a set of routines that addressed water, food, shelter, and basic protection. These routines were not fixed, but changed as conditions shifted and resources were used or replaced. Time during this period was measured less by calendar dates and more by repetition. Daily tasks defined structure. The island did not provide direction, but it allowed for continuity. Survival at this stage was not yet stable, but it had become possible. As the months extended into years, Selkirk's survival shifted from immediate response to structured routine. The island remained isolated, but within that isolation, a pattern of movement and activity began to form. Each task was repeated, refined, and adjusted based on necessity. He divided his time between essential functions, securing food, maintaining shelter, and preserving physical condition. Hunting goats became central. Without firearms, he relied entirely on pursuit. The terrain of the island, steep ridges, narrow paths, and open slopes required balance and endurance. Over time, Selkirk adapted physically. Contemporary accounts later described his speed and agility as notable, suggesting he had become capable of outrunning or cornering animals through familiarity with their routes. This method of hunting also shaped his daily movement. Rather than remaining in one place, he traveled across different parts of the island, following herds and observing patterns. These movements reduced dependence on any single area and allowed him to manage resources more evenly. Fishing continued to supplement his diet, though it was dependent on access to the shoreline and changing weather conditions. Coastal areas were not always safe, and waves could limit approach. When conditions allowed, fish provided variation and reduced the need for constant hunting. Plant gathering remained consistent. Wild cabbage and other vegetation offered nutrients that meat alone could not provide. Selkirk learned where these plants grew and returned to those areas regularly. This reduced uncertainty and minimized wasted effort. His shelters became more organized over time. Historical records suggest he maintained 2 huts, one used for sleeping, the other for cooking and storage. This separation reduced the risk of fire damage and helped preserve what little structure he had built. Repairs were ongoing. Wood and vegetation degraded, and constant maintenance was required to keep the shelters functional. Fire management became routine rather than reactive. Selkirk maintained a steady source of flame, protecting it from wind and rain. Cooking, warmth, and food preparation all depended on it. The loss of fire would have required significant effort to restore, so it remained a priority in his daily schedule. Clothing, made from goat skins, was replaced as needed. This process required time and manual effort, using simple tools to shape and secure the material. These garments were more durable than the clothing he had arrived with and better suited to the environment. Beyond physical survival, routine served another purpose. It provided structure in the absence of external direction. With no human contact and no fixed calendar, repetition became a way to organize time. Tasks were performed not only out of necessity, but also to maintain consistency. Selkirk also engaged in activities that did not directly relate to survival. Accounts indicate he read from the Bible he had brought with him. This practice likely contributed to maintaining language and cognitive stability. Without regular use, speech and structured thought can decline in prolonged isolation. Reading aloud or silently would have helped preserve both. The island itself did not change significantly during this period. Weather patterns shifted and seasons passed, but the environment remained largely consistent. Selkirk's relationship to it, however, evolved. What had initially been unfamiliar terrain became mapped through repeated movement and use. By this stage, survival was no longer uncertain in the immediate sense. Food, water, and shelter were managed through established methods. The greater challenge was no longer how to live from day to day, but how to continue over an indefinite span of time without external contact. As the years progressed, the practical systems Selkirk had established remained functional. Food could be obtained, shelter could be maintained, water was accessible. These conditions reduced immediate physical risk, but they did not address the effects of prolonged isolation. There was no human contact during this period, no conversation, no shared tasks, and no external confirmation of time or events. The absence of interaction created a different form of pressure, one that developed gradually rather than suddenly. Selkirk's environment offered little variation. The same terrain, the same routines, and the same boundaries repeated without interruption. Over time, this repetition affected perception. Without a calendar or consistent markers, the distinction between days became less defined. Time was measured through activity rather than sequence. Weeks and months could not be tracked with precision. Historical accounts suggest that Selkirk maintained some level of structure through reading and spoken recitation. The Bible he carried became more than a religious text. It functioned as a tool for maintaining language and rhythm. Regular reading would have provided a form of continuity, reinforcing patterns of thought that might otherwise weaken in isolation. There were moments when the isolation was interrupted, but not in ways that reduced risk. On at least 2 occasions, ships approached the island. These were Spanish vessels, operating in a region where Selkirk, as part of a British privateering expedition, would have been considered an enemy. Capture under such conditions could have resulted in imprisonment or execution. During these encounters, Selkirk avoided detection. He moved inland, using the terrain for concealment. The same knowledge of the island that supported his survival also allowed him to remain hidden. These events introduced brief periods of heightened awareness, but they did not alter his situation. The ships departed, and the island returned to silence. Physical strain also accumulated over time. Hunting without tools required sustained effort. Minor injuries, cuts, falls, muscle strain would have been unavoidable. Without medical supplies, recovery depended entirely on rest and natural healing. Illness, if it occurred, would have been managed without treatment. Despite these conditions, Selkirk continued to function within the system he had created. His routines did not disappear. They adapted slightly when necessary, but remained consistent overall. This consistency may have limited the impact of isolation, providing a framework that reduced uncertainty. There is limited direct record of his internal state. No journal survives from his time on the island. What is known comes from later accounts, recorded after his rescue. These suggest that while the isolation was difficult, it did not lead to complete disorientation or incapacity. Instead, the effect was cumulative. The absence of human presence, the repetition of environment, and the lack of temporal reference combined into a steady, ongoing condition. It did not end on its own. It continued until an external event interrupted it. In February 1709, more than 4 years after Selkirk had been left on the island, 2 British ships approached the Juan Fernandez archipelago. These were the Duke and the Duchess, privateering vessels commanded by Woodes Rogers, an English captain operating in the Pacific. The ships anchored offshore to take on water and assess the island. Such stops were standard procedure during long voyages. At first, there was no expectation of finding anyone there. The island had no known permanent inhabitants, and any previous visitors were assumed to have left. From the shore, Selkirk saw the ships arrive. This was not the first time vessels had appeared, but the circumstances were different. The flags and behavior of the ships suggested they were not Spanish. Even so, caution remained necessary. He had spent years avoiding detection when uncertain. Eventually, he made contact. Accounts from Rogers and his crew describe a man approaching them from the island. His appearance reflected the conditions of his isolation. His clothing was made from goat skins. His hair and beard had grown untrimmed. His movements were described as quick and controlled, shaped by years of physical adaptation to the terrain. Communication was possible, but not immediate in the usual sense. Selkirk had spent years without speaking to another person. His speech was reported to be affected at first, requiring time to return to normal patterns. Despite this, he was able to explain his situation and identify himself. The crew confirmed his account. Records of the earlier expedition in the Cinque Ports supported his story. It was later established that the ship he had left had indeed been lost, validating his original concerns about its condition. Selkirk was taken aboard the Duke. His physical condition, while altered, was stable. He had maintained strength through constant activity and a consistent food supply. The transition back to shipboard life began immediately, though the adjustment would take time. After more than 4 years of complete isolation, his separation from the island ended in a direct and practical manner. There was no ceremony, only a change in circumstance. After his rescue in 1709, Alexander Selkirk did not return immediately to a settled life. He joined the expedition, led by Woodes Rogers, and continued at sea for a period of time. His experience on the island had altered his abilities in ways that were immediately useful. He served as a guide and resource, particularly when ships needed to navigate or resupply along unfamiliar coasts. Over time, Selkirk returned to Britain. His account of isolation became known through published reports, including Rogers' own writings. These descriptions provided one of the earliest detailed records of long-term solitary survival in a remote environment. The account was not presented as fiction, but as observation and example of what had occurred under specific conditions. His experience later influenced literature. The most well-known connection is to Robinson Crusoe, published in 1719 by Daniel Defoe. While the novel is fictional, it draws on elements that parallel Selkirk's documented time on the island. The similarities are structural rather than exact, but the connection remains widely recognized. Selkirk eventually returned to seafaring work. Records indicate that he served again in the Royal Navy. In 1721, he died aboard the ship Weymouth, near the coast of West Africa. The cause of death is believed to have been illness, though details are limited. His years on the island remain the most defined period of his life. They demonstrate a form of survival based not on sudden action, but on sustained adjustment. There were no external interventions during that time, no assistance, only the gradual development of methods that allowed continuation under isolation. The island did not change. The conditions did not improve. What changed was his ability to exist within them. His survival was not marked by a single event, but by duration.